This meeting is being recorded.
All right, hi there, comrades. Thanks a lot for showing up for the second lecture in our series on political economy. It's going to be on pre-capitalist modes of production. I'm going to try to keep this interactive. I've put together a big plan for what I'm going to talk about, and also I want to be interactive with you guys so you can ask questions and we can have a discussion throughout it, and maybe even have an even more thorough discussion at the end. But there's a lot of stuff we got to get through, and I'm going to try to make it all within 1 hour. So without further ado, I'm going to start. Just before I do, though, I want to mention that we should all have our microphones muted before, unless you're responding to a question, obviously, or asking one. And there's a couple things that I think are important to note before we start talking about political economy as you know, a science in general. The first thing is that the characterizations that we're going to make are not static. So what this means is that, like, societies don't just go from slave society to feudalism to capitalism. There are transitory periods between all of these societies in which society has a lot of aspects of slave society, but also a feudal society at the same time. So it's important to understand that these societies in human development move within each other, and not statically, not separate, but in communication with each other. So that goes in the second thing I wanted to say, that there's no definite point at which we can say feudalism completely ended and capitalism completely began, for example. But there are points in history where we can say that, like, they're the defining moments of that turn. For example, the French Revolution is one example of that. And the third thing I want to say is just to remind people about this transitory period. It's really important to understand when studying political economy, because we need to understand it as a sort of living organism and not as rigid categories. Because I mean, there are things that are very specific to certain periods, like slave society and feudal society, and there's things that have existed throughout all of these societies, like commodities, for example. Commodities, although commodity production is predominant in capitalism, it also existed in previous societies. So we just have to keep that in mind. But without further ado, that's all I wanted to say. I'm going to get started with the first part of the textbook on political economy, which starts basically with the evolution of man, because the development of nature is actually very similar to the development of society, because they both evolved dialectically. And this was a kind of field of study of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as well. They were also anthropologists, and they were also experts in the field of evolutionary biology as well. So, you know, at the beginning of the textbook, the textbook takes from the anthropological findings, actually, of Marx and Engels, and we see through that nature and human society both evolve dialectically, meaning through the collision of internal contradictions that give rise to new forces. This is how society develops, and this is even in nature how evolution develops. This is illustrated by the process of evolution, which is basically the result of the sum of the struggles between creatures and forces of nature or other creatures involved in natural selection. And this is pretty similar to how society moves forward, because society develops and moves forward based on the Marxist understanding of the world through class struggle, through the reconciling of, through the struggle of irreconcilable contradictions within society, by which we mean classes of any specific stage in society, social classes. So the textbook begins by talking about the line between human and animal that was drawn. And it was drawn once the latest predecessors of humanity began to not just use, but also produce tools. This is a very important thing to understand, because even some animals use tools, but to produce tools, to use tools for the production of other tools, this is something that's specific only to humans. And this led Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to the understanding that labor is the center of human societal development, labor. He writes specifically, Engels, that the prime basic condition, quote, the prime basic condition for all human existence And this to such an extent that, in a sense, we have to say that labor created man himself. So that's a quote from Engels that's cited in the textbook when we're talking about even before human society, but how humans came to being, how humans as the concept as we understand it today came into being. And this brings us to our discussion on the first stage of human society, which is primitive communism. And we call it primitive communism for the aspects that characterize this period. And I wanted to ask you all to basically name some of these aspects that you read about in the book. So what were some aspects that were characteristic of human society in what we read regarding a primitive communist society? If you'd like to answer, you could use the raise hand function, and then I'll call on you and you can unmute. All right, Elizabeth.
People made tools and used them together. They, with the production of implements and the application of them, that was done in common.
Right, exactly. Property was held in common. There was no concept of private property at the time, only communal property as well as personal property. Like people did have articles that they felt like they were owned, but that they held themselves, but it was not, in a sense, private productive property. This corresponds to the character of the productive forces of this period, meaning the means of production were extremely limited. They only had the most basic tools. And one thing that Marx said that's cited in this textbook is that this primitive type of collective or cooperative production was, of course, the result of the weakness of the individual and not of the socialization of the means of production. So this is why it's called primitive communism, because the communism that Marx envisioned as the next step after socialism that comes after capitalism is socialized ownership of the means of production when they have reached a very, very high technical level. But in primitive communism, we mean communal ownership of the means of production that are, their bare minimum. So that's exactly a defining aspect of primitive communism. Firas, did you want to give something else?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
There was also equal distribution of the products of their labor, namely the food that they gathered and hunted. And this was out of necessity because you had to keep all the members of the tribe, if you will, alive and sustained.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point. Ryan, did you have another one?
Hey, yeah. So as I was reading this, it seemed like each stage there was two transitions or two phases in each stage. And for this one, there seemed to be a clan stage, which evolved into a village. And during the clan phase, there was this, what they described as a natural economy, where consumption was the main purpose of production. And that eventually transitioned when this cattle economy arose and eventually exchange. So I guess I would just highlight that there's kind of two phases in each one of these stages.
Right, that's a good point. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later, how society, these class societies are always in a stage of either regression or progression. Depends on where it is. That's a good point. But does anyone have any other aspects of specifically primitive communist society? Aaron, did you want to chime in?
Oh yeah, one thing I thought was really interesting was the lack of private property. How they were saying because there wasn't private property, there wasn't a like a circumstance for there to like be exploitation of man by man. Mm-hmm. And I guess like the other two forms of modes of production, they are pretty predicated on exploitation. And yeah, I would say probably the absence of like exploitation by man, of man by man, is probably like a specific like feature of like primitives. communism, or at least that's what I got from it. I don't know if that was
No, yeah,
that's accurate. Yeah, okay.
That's a key aspect of primitive communist society, and that ties into a lot of other aspects that are connected to it. For example, in primitive communist society, there was no production of surplus value, which is the value that comes about when someone labors past what they need just to sustain themselves and their family. And because of that, there were no social classes and there was no state. These are all connected to what you just said about the lack of exploitation of man by man. So that's really good. Okay, I'm going to just go over some others, but those were really all very good answers. Those are basically the main socioeconomic takeaways. I'm going to go over just a couple periphery ones, I would say. It's also important to understand that the reason that the mode of production was this way and that the means of production, the reason that the mode of production was at this level was because humans existed in a constant life and death struggle against nature. This is why there was no surplus value. This is why everything was held in common. It was out of necessity because of the low level of productivity of the means of production. We also have to understand that that hunting and gathering was the main source of subsistence economy throughout most of the primitive economy stage until, like Ryan said before, until we get into talking about clans and stuff, where agriculture starts to take a bigger role. And also, it's important to understand that in primitive communism, this society was primarily matriarchal. As opposed to patriarchal, which we'll see later, meaning that the woman, the female gender, was actually where heredity was traced, and the woman had the foremost position in society in front of the male. So according to the textbook, the basic economic law of primitive communism we're talking about here is exactly this, that the necessary means of production are secured by means of primitive implements of production. It's on the base of communal ownership of the means of production and by means of common labor and equal distribution of the products. So that's basically those main points you guys said when I asked the question. So that's really good. I'm going to go through a bit of the details that the first chapter talked about in terms of historical examples and to kind of elaborate on the things we just talked about just now. So specifically, this stage of society, primitive communism, it took place over thousands of years. I think it's safe to say that in a lot of the world, this stage of society probably took the longest, rather as opposed to the other ones. We saw that as society's productive forces developed in this stage, so did a natural division of labor, which made things which made labor more productive. Men were delegated to hunting, women were delegated to gathering as well as housekeeping. But still, even at this point, when a division of labor was made between men and women, equal distribution of wealth continued to be the norm. But eventually, like Ryan mentioned earlier, clan society came into existence. This was basically the first form of organization that clearly differentiated humans from animals. Before that, people basically existed in hordes, just like any sort of primate or apes. And this clan society only included people in kinship relationship to one another, and it united them in common labor. So basically hereditary ties. People outside the clan were generally regarded as hostile, and everything was based, like I said, on blood relation. And this, an interesting example that was included in the textbook that I wanted to talk about a little, because of the fact that it was still in existence so close to our current day and age. We're talking about the 19th century, in which clan life was still observed in Native American tribes, specifically the Iroquois, which is mentioned in the textbook. And the person who carried out these observations noted that women carried out basic field work and dealt with gathering, and they held a matriarchal position in the clan. Men took care of hunting and fishing, as well as making the implements of labor and construction, but hard labor like cutting down trees and clearing fields, this was done in common. And again, in these Iroquois tribes, or clans rather, the lineage of people was traced through the mother, not the father, as we know today. And chiefs had no material benefits. This is an important thing as well. Chiefs had authority in Native American tribes at this point of the Iroquois that's mentioned here, but they did not have material benefits. It was simply a status, and obviously it came with responsibilities as well. In terms of the specific achievements throughout primitive communism, there were a few that we have to talk about, resulting specifically from man's struggle to survive. Again, we're looking at this dialectically. And for example, you know what, let's see if anyone can give me a couple examples of what they read in the textbook that were steps forward that resulted from man's conflict with nature. Does anyone have any ideas? There were a few key moments that were listed in the textbook. Yeah, Ryan?
The Iron Age was a big one, producing iron tools, which kind of revolutionized agriculture. And yeah, iron technology. Yeah,
I would say metal smelting in general, just because iron played a big part even in slave society more so. But yeah, the development of iron was towards the end of primitive communism. But if we want to talk about exclusively in primitive communism, I would say like the development of bronze and metal smelting in general. These were huge accomplishments in the primitive communist stage of society. Firas, did you want to give another example?
Yeah, there was the advent of language and the ability to communicate between one another.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And Aaron?
Oh yeah, the discovery of fire, or I guess how to create fire, because before they would have to like wait for a lightning strike or wildfire and kind of like preserve the flame for as long as they could. But once they were able to figure out how to like reproduce fire, they could, you know, resist the cold and protect themselves from larger animals and stuff and whatnot.
Yeah, this was one of the main ones I was going for, because like you said, in the textbook, it talks about the fact that man for many thousands of years knew about the existence of fire. They had seen, they had observed how lightning had struck the earth and caused fires, but it took a while for them to discover how to harness fire. And when they did, this dramatically improved the standard of living and productivity of humans from this period. And another thing that we gotta mention also is the invention of the bow and arrow. This drastically increased the productivity of mankind's one of mankind's main sources of subsistence, which was hunting. And this was developed during the primitive communist period. And in terms of this period as a whole, we have to understand that the apex of it basically took place under matriarchy. And then once matriarchy began to decline and turn into patriarchy, that was as primitive communism really began to shift into the next stage of society. But it's not because matriarchy began to decline. Actually, the decline of matriarchy is tied specifically to an economic development that happened in the primitive communist period. Does anyone know who that? Can anyone name what that is? It's one of the biggest economic discoveries of humans in that period. Yeah, is that Marissa? Sorry, your mic's off. We can't hear you.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
I put down, so matriarchy, when the breeding of the cattle changed to pastoral economy, more developed agriculture became men's concern. Is this too far down? And then matriarchal got replaced with the paternal clan. Is that what you're going for?
Oh, well, yeah, that's exactly what I was going for. Basically, agriculture, the development of agriculture and the discovery of, the concept of agriculture is basically what began the movement away from matriarchy to patriarchy. And the reason for that is because agriculture and animal husbandry was the vocation of the man in the primitive communist tribe. Exactly. Over the span of many years, this form of economy of agriculture and animal husbandry, it began to outstrip hunting and gathering in terms of its effectiveness at providing people with food and materials connected to livestock as well. So I wanted to go on to describe the effects of the development of agriculture on social relations as it became basically the decisive sector of economic life, because this is basically the eve of class society. There's several important aspects that completely changed because of agriculture. First of all, it became possible to accumulate surplus value. This is what agriculture introduced to human society for the first time: the ability to make enough agricultural products not just to sustain yourself and your family, but also to save for sowing the next year, or to have more products to feed your livestock, and even exchange at one point. But we'll get to that later. People also became sedentary in accordance with the requirements of farming. They began to stay in one place. Clans, like I said before, became patriarchal because of the division of labor, because men were assigned to agriculture in the division of labor that existed at that point. And also, the big thing is that exchange began to develop because of agriculture. But it wasn't at this point the kind of exchange as we understand now, like between individuals. That didn't exist yet. Exchange existed between clan communities, and but still within the clan, everything was held in common still. So basically, this led to the first great social division of labor, which is what it's called in the textbook. The division of labor between pastoral tribes, which focused on accumulating a surplus of animal products, and agricultural tribes that focused on products connected to the land. And the fact that these people that were producing animal products needed agricultural products and vice versa, this began the first sort of exchange on a large scale between clans. And as Ryan mentioned before, actually, about the Iron Age, the handiwork of craftsmen also entered into exchange, and this was made possible by the Bronze and Iron Ages in primitive communism. Like I was talking about before, in relation to the Iron Age, the last stage of patriarchy took place during this time, and the last stage of patriarchy was essentially at the same time, sort of the beginning of slave society. We'll get into that soon. And this happened because the mode of production or production relations ceased to correspond to new productive forces. What does this mean? It means that the sort of former communal property relations and the necessity for groups of people to work together in a life and death struggle against nature ceased to become relevant with the development of agriculture. With more efficient tools, it became more lucrative to farm with less people, actually, as the necessity of joint labor became obsolete. The labor of one family, it became enough to work a plot of land and receive the necessities of life as well as a surplus. And this all, of course, is connected to the origin of private property, which began to appear at the latter end of primitive communism and in the early stage of slave society. It's inseparably linked with the social division of labor and the development of exchange as well. We got to talk about the fact that as exchange developed, they began to consider, the patriarchs of clan communities began to consider the property of the community their own. This is when the concept of private property began to develop as exchange developed, because at the beginning, when clans were exchanging with one another, everything was still, like I said before, considered communal property of the clan. But as time went on, this mentality began to change, specifically with cattle. It was the first to fall under the category of private property. Military leaders and elders of the clans began to consider that their private property, and then the implements of production followed as well. But land was actually the last to be privatized. That came quite later. And essentially this also led to the breakdown of the clan itself, because that institution was formed out of society based on communal property. And what came out of the decline of these clans was what were patriarchal families. These were families that were headed by a man, and his wife was essentially considered his property as well, and the rest of the people in his family under him. And this led to a social formation that is really similar to the clan, but different in a key way, which was called the village community. It's different in the sense that people were no longer bound by blood to stick together. And these village communities were comprised of different holdings of people. There were houses, cattle, instruments of production that were held privately, but natural amenities like the woods and water, the meadows, they were actually held in common. And even the land for a while was plowed in common. But the rise of private property in exchange created social and economic antagonisms within society, leading to the formation of classes. Like I said before, the elders, the military leaders, and I didn't mention the priests, but they're also important to mention here. They began to consider clan and village property their own private property, and they began to use their positions to enrich themselves economically. They formed an aristocracy separate from the masses. In ancient Rome, this is basically the origin of the difference between the patrician and the plebeian. The patrician, and this is not the slave master slave difference. This is even older than that, actually. The patrician was a member of this, privileged aristocracy, and the plebeian was everyone else. And this is characteristic of that time in primitive communist society, where the lower classes began to fall into economic dependence upon the upper class. And because of this developing situation, the centralization of the surplus into the hands of these former clan elders and military leaders, and the formation of classes, this also gave rise to the formation of the state. The ruling class formed a state to protect its interest. And so basically what began to happen was that this establishment of a sedentary agricultural lifestyle, combined with the ability to accumulate surplus value, it made it advantageous for when people captured prisoners not to kill them, but to put them to work as slaves, because enough surplus was gathered by these or accumulated by these village elders and this new ruling class, that they were able to sustain slaves. They were able to feed them and keep them keep them alive, basically, and use their labor power to accumulate further surplus. And this eventually evolved into the main mode of production as the riches of the aristocracy grew exponentially, as the gap between the rich and poor widened, and there also became a number of indebted tribesmen who weren't able to establish their stake in this new society. They were also converted into slaves, and so slave society emerged. And this was the first society in which man appropriated another man's labor without compensating him, which is, as Aaron said before, exploitation of man by man. And this section of the textbook ends with a very good point, that history and anthropology actually refute the bourgeois idea that private property has always existed. This is a myth, a capitalist myth, that private property has always existed. It has not. Nor has the state. There's always been, in obviously the animal world and even primitive communism, there's like systems of authority, but this is different from the state, which is an organization of armed men, intended on enforcing the will of the ruling class to defend their interests. So to give several conclusions, because all of these chapters end with short conclusions about each society. I wanted to go over them at the end of my talk on each society. The first short conclusion that we can have is that from our reading is that labor is what allowed humanity to rise out of the animal world. And basically labor is the source of all value throughout human societies, regardless of which one we're talking about. What primitive society is characterized by? It's extremely primitive implements of production, collective and uniform labor, common ownership of the means of production within a very narrow framework, equal distribution, no classes or exploitation of man by man, and no state. Of course, like I said at the beginning of this, we got to understand all these societies not statically, but in communication with each other, because the line between primitive society and slave society is not so clear. Things develop in a direction, but some things in this transition period between primitive society, primitive communism and slave society, there's a period where aspects of both societies exist. So it's important to also understand that. And the basic economic law of primitive communism, as explained by the textbook, is that man secured vitally necessary means of subsistence with the help of primitive implements of production on the basis of communal property in the means of production by means of common labor and equal distribution. So that is all I had to say about primitive communist society. These are the main takeaways. And at the end of the presentation, we can all have a discussion about either society if you guys have questions or anything. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to roll through slave society and feudalism so we have enough time for everything. So now we're going to go on to slave society. This is the beginning of society with social classes. There were no social classes in primitive communism. Slave society is the first class society in human history. And it also was the first and crudest and most brutal form of exploitation of man by man in human history. It's existed among almost all peoples. It's existed among all peoples whose social development occurred organically, meaning it wasn't visited by colonialism in the primitive communist period of development. Any societies that rose above primitive communist society organically ran into the slave mode of production. And this slave owning system, it reached its height of development in Europe, in Rome, around the 2nd century BC to 2nd century AD. This was basically the height of the slave mode of production in Europe. I say in Europe because we also have to understand that in the Far East there was also the slave mode of production, but it was on a bit of a different timetable. And I'm not going to get too much into that for the sake of time. I wish I could, but we're going to get through the general aspects of all of these societies. This slave society, it originated with a chiefly domestic and patriarchal economy with comparatively few slaves, actually. This is how this mode of production began. It was not slave when this society was coming into fruition. Slave labor was not actually the basis of production. It played a subsidiary part to the domestic economy, meaning patriarchal families that had their own farms, and slaves were employed as auxiliary labor to that. The master's power was also absolute, as throughout all of slave society, but the sphere in which he was able to apply his power was very limited because of the fact that the productive forces in early slave society were very underdeveloped. But what really gave birth to a further development of slave society was the second great social division of labor. We talked about the first great social division of labor, which was between animal husbandry and agriculture in the time of primitive communism. Now this is the second great social division of labor. This is the separation of handicraft from agriculture, because under primitive communism, craftsmanship was basically a secondary occupation of herdsmen. But with the further development of tools, weaving, and metalworking, craftsmanship became an independent occupation. And slave society had two basic branches of production, agriculture and handicraft. And this division further developed exchange from what it was in primitive society between agriculture and animal husbandry. This led to further development in labor productivity, allowing the ruling class to accumulate larger quantities of surplus value and intensify exploitation of their workers. It's also important to note that slave society throughout its existence generally had a natural economy. This means that the products that society makes are intended for consumption within that economy. So they're not produced for exchange. That would make it, if they were produced for exchange, that would be a commodity economy, because a commodity is a good that's produced exclusively for the purpose of exchanging it for money. And this was never the overwhelming trend in slave society as it is now in capitalist society, but commodity production did exist in slave society, and we're going to get to that later. It saw the emergence of commodities, for example, slave society, but still, this was on a very low level because exchange was also very underdeveloped at the time. In fact, there were still no, in slave society, there were still no like exclusive enterprises, like exclusive large enterprises that just produced commodities for the sake of making money. Craftsmen sold a certain part of their produce on the market to buy raw materials and pay taxes, while peasants had to sell part of their harvest to afford things as well, even though they consumed most of what they produced. So this is not exactly a commodity economy. This is still a natural economy in which people sold part of their produce to be able to exchange with other sectors of the economy. But the division of agriculture from handicraft and the emergence of commodities and commodity production did give rise to the first formation of, gave rise to the initial formation of what we consider to be towns. And consequently, it gave rise to the millennia-old antithesis between town and country, the division between town and countryside. We also can talk about the emergence of money, because during this time period, money also emerged. It emerged when exchange expanded and it became a regular phenomenon. And by money, I mean a universal commodity that made trade easier. It wasn't at first a metallic currency. At the beginning, early stages of slave society, cattle were used as money. Salt, grains, furs, anything that was like commonly needed by most people in an area at a time. I mean, I don't know how many of you know, but like one example of money that is not a metallic currency is like cigarettes in prison. Like prisoners use cigarettes as currency. This is just one example, but this was eventually supplanted by metallic currencies pretty early on. And even though money existed from a very early stage of slave society, most transactions, most exchanges were still done in kind, meaning this guy had something I want, I have something he wants, we just exchange, instead of actually exchanging some sort of commodity that was considered to be money. On the whole, production was carried out for the personal consumption of the slave owner, but money, it's also important to note that money didn't only serve at this point a means of exchange, but also capital. And when we talk about money serving the purpose of capital, we mean that money was used with a view of appropriating the surplus value of workers. This was first expressed itself, this capital, as both merchant and usurer capital. I'm going to talk about merchant capital first. Well, the vocation of merchants, it emerged as the quantity of commodities increased. It eventually became necessary to have people that would just go around. Their entire vocation would be to find buyers and sellers of certain commodities. And the emergence of merchant capital expanded the territorial limits of exchange because of that. It allowed for exchange to go on farther distances than was possible when two people with two different products were just in communication with each other. And these merchants, they appropriated a large share of the surplus value exploited by the slave masters. Obviously, they had to make money too, and their whole vocation was not productive. They, they bought up tons of products as commodities to go sell them for a lot more money elsewhere for profit. So in a sense, these people also were part of the system that exploited the labor of the slaves of the society, as well as the small peasants as well. There was also a small peasantry that was considered free at the time, but I'll get to that later. The expansion of production and exchange under these social conditions made property ownership significantly more unequal. We also have to talk about that. The poor were compelled basically by threat of starvation or enslavement to turn to the rich for loans. And the latter group was further concentrating the means of production in its hands. And this is what gave rise to usury, basically. Usury is the provision of loans at outrageous interest rates that most of the time, if people have to come to usurers, there's no way they're going to be able to pay it back. But like I said, I mean, the kind of people that entered these kind of obligations had no other choice because they couldn't afford. I mean, they were compelled by threat of starvation or enslavement to turn to these usurers for money because they had to pay other debts. And this, in turn, as usury emerged, the ruling class began to privatize land en masse. This was when the privatization of land really began, because if a debtor couldn't pay his obligations, at one point he had to abandon his land, and he would have to sell himself and his family into slavery. This also granted, the usurers also granted the slave owning class loans as well. But because obviously they had so much money, they were able to pay. And usurers often gave them better rates. So they too took a chunk of the surplus value of society through these actions as well. And so this led to the formation of a landed slave owning class. This is when we started seeing a transition from patriarchal families that owned slaves as subsidiary labor, but did a lot of the work themselves, into large landed slave owning class, into a large land owning slave using ruling class. And so the pre-existing small peasant economy that existed in early slave society began to break down. It was replaced by an economy dominated by these landowning slave masters and the oppressed classes that basically did their bidding, which was primarily the slaves, but of course there were a lot of other classes of people as well. And this is basically what we call the slave owning mode of production. And society was divided into basically people who were free and unfree. The unfree were the slaves, very obviously, but there were a number of other classes that existed in society aside from the landed slave owners who were considered free. Does anyone remember what some of those classes might have been? Free classes that were not large landowners but still existed in slave society? Yeah, Aaron.
Were like handy workers or like the carpenters, like those. I think that's what it was. I may be a little off on that. Yeah, could you? Is that like, were they kind of like the handy workers of like people who would kind of like fix the tools or like provide tools that the slaves would ultimately use to carry out the their labor for slave owners?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I would lump them together though with peasants that had their own small land holdings. These I would lump together with small producers because they existed freely, but they even used slave labor on a smaller scale to get done what they needed to get done. And exactly. They were in contradiction with the ruling class because it's also important to note this class was constantly falling into the ranks of the slave class. In early society, in early slave society, the main form of accumulating slaves was from indebting this class and taking away their land and turning them into slaves. And it was extremely difficult for them to compete with the landed slave owners who had far more labor employed on far larger plots of land. Can anyone name any other classes, social classes of slave society? Marissa?
I put like a hierarchy type thing, and I did large scale slaveholders, landowners at the top,
Mhm.
priests, craftsmen, peasants, slaves, women.
Yeah, that's a good point too. I was going to get to that a little bit later. But I guess I'll talk about it a bit now as well. It's important to note that women, basically in slave society, had the same social status of slaves almost universally. I mean, there are some exceptions, I guess. I guess Cleopatra, but by and large, this was women were unfortunately considered slaves. Ryan, did you have another class to add or anything?
Yeah, the one that I haven't seen mentioned is merchants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was also a class of people, merchants. Another one that nobody mentioned was the clergy. Actually, there's not that much written about it in the textbook, but it's also important to keep them in mind because they were attached to the class of landed slave owners at the time of slave society, and they played an important role for the ruling class there. So, but yeah, that pretty much covers all of it, all of the classes in slave society. Yeah, here, okay, I see written now regarding Marissa, what we're talking about in terms of women. I wanted to talk about the what it meant to be a slave in slave society. I mean, obviously, they were deprived of all rights and they were considered property of the slave owners. They could be bought, sold, killed with impunity. It didn't matter. They had the same status as property. Slave owners, they not only owned the means of production, but also the very workers who produced things. Brute force and brutal penalties were used to keep them in line. Incentive was not even really a concept. And many of them even wore iron collars that had their owners' names on them. And because of all these conditions, the entire surplus value of labor was taken by the master. And so at this point of society, the master held the entire share of the slave's surplus value, but it's also important to understand that at this level of society, technology was so low that an individual laborer who was a slave and was disinterested in the labor, obviously because he was a slave, their surplus value produced was very low. It was very unproductive. Here I wanted to also note that women, although they were not necessarily all put to hard labor in the fields or anything. I mean, there were like wives of landed slave owners. Their wives and their daughters and everything were still basically considered property of the man who owned the land, and so women in general had that status as well. And this is the prime class contradiction of slave society. Obviously, the contradiction between slave and master. Which ultimately in slave society expands upon the state that was developed at the end of primitive communism. Does anyone want to talk about how the state developed in slave society? I've got a list of things here that we could talk about, but I thought maybe some of you have some input. There's a part about, Sophia?
Yeah, so I guess from what I gathered is that the creation of the state was there so it could keep the interests of the ruling class secured.
Yeah, exactly. More specifically, the clan leaders that were like I said before, that were beginning to use their power to enrich themselves more and more, they combined into unions. They united to enforce their interests on the slaves as landed slave owners, to be able to, enforce this system of slave ownership and production. In this specifically, we're talking about clan elders and military leaders that became the ancient princes and kings as we know them today. The clan lost all of its resemblance to its former existence, basically, and became the state. The authority of the clan became the state, while the former authorities uniting continuously basically became the state in slave-owning society. And this class used the state to basically impose huge taxes on the peasantry as well. And this continued to contribute to the small peasantry's continued enslavement, which, like I said before, was the main source of developing or accumulating slaves in early slave society. And also in the textbook texts or quotes Lenin here, and I thought this quote from Lenin in an article he wrote called "The State" was particularly good, so I decided to add it here. He says, "Only when the first form of division of society into classes appeared, only when slavery appeared, when a certain class of people, by concentrating on the crudest forms of agricultural labor, could produce a certain surplus, when this surplus was not absolutely essential for the wretched existence of the slave and passed in the hands of the slave owner, when in this way the existence of this class of slave owners took firm root, and in order that it might take firm root, it was essential that the state should appear." So that's basically a sum up of what we were talking about. An example of this, I mean, historically, is democracy in ancient Greece. We call it democracy, but only land-owning men were able to participate, and they were in, this very small minority of society. And these were the characteristics of the ruling class that, in that society, excluded all slaves and landless freemen from governance. And it's a clear example of how the ruling class exerts its will through the state. And just like in capitalist society today, I mean, the only people that can afford to influence the outcome of politics or through campaign donations are members of the capitalist class. Same thing today. But now we're going to get to basically the turning point of slave society, when it began to develop to its highest point, because as slave society developed, so did the demand for slaves themselves. And in the first half of slave society, like I said, slaves were accumulated primarily through the indebting of the small peasantry and concurrent enslavement of them. But at the height of slave-owning society, war became more and more the primary source of obtaining new slaves. In the Far East, in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, war was basically constantly occurring, and slaves were traded as commodities at fairs after being captured in war. This, as slave society went further down the road, this became the predominant form of accumulating slaves. But it's also important to note, we're trying to look at the development of society scientifically, right? And although slave society was brutal, it was an exploitative, terrible system, it was also, an essential stage on the social development of human society, and it allowed for society's productive forces to expand past the constraints of primitive communist society. A couple examples of this were that it would have been in primitive communist society, for example, impossible to construct the pyramids because slave society allowed for mass coordination of human labor that primitive society just could not do because of the constraints of that time. It also set the base for further social development, and there were a lot of achievements in the fields of mathematics, astronomy, mechanics, philosophy, culture, and architecture during this time. So, it's important to understand that these are objective steps forward in human development that took place during this period. Still, technology, in terms of productive technologies, they were employed at an extremely low level. By and large, everything was produced with people's bare hands. And what's also more interesting to note is that at the beginning of slave society, like we said, slaves were an auxiliary labor force. The slave owners still worked in the fields and had their families work as well. But as slave society began to develop and the wealth of society and amount of slaves in society became more and more concentrated onto large land holdings, hard labor began to become more and more associated with slaves. And the ruling class distanced itself as much as possible from hard labor because of that kind of that taboo associated with hard labor that developed. This is where the antithesis between mental labor and physical labor developed, and that antithesis still exists today. You know, when people look down on blue-collar workers or something like that, that comes from slave society. Slave masters, they began to work exclusively in public affairs, diplomacy and war leadership roles, and they just continuously more and more began to distance themselves from any sort of hard labor. On top of that, the vast majority of surplus in this society, we have to understand, was spent completely unproductively on luxuries for the rulers, you know, as opposed to, you know, now in capitalist society, the fact that you know, capitalists obviously still spend a huge amount of the surplus value on luxuries and for their own unproductive purposes. But because of the fact that capitalists rule over huge corporations with a lot of capital, much more of the appropriated labor is used to reproduce currently existing capital than back in slave society, when the only capital they needed was to reproduce the existence of slaves, and the rest was basically just used on luxuries and for unproductive purposes. So there's a lot more to go through in slave society, but I'm going to try to get it done quickly because we're already on an hour here. But basically, the basic economic law of slave society consisted in production of surplus value to satisfy the demands of slave owners by means of the you know, terribly extreme exploitation of the slaves, on the basis, this was all on the basis of full ownership of by the slave owners of the means of production and the workers who worked in it, the slaves, and by the ruining and enslaving of the peasants and the craftsmen, and also by conquering and enslaving people of other countries. These were the way that slaves were accumulated. But now we're getting into the demise of slave society and the development of feudalism. So there are a number of irreconcilable contradictions in slave society that gave rise to its destruction. So let's talk a little bit about them. Can anyone name some of these contradictions in late slave society that gave rise to its destruction? Yeah, Aaron?
Oh yeah, you kind of mentioned it already, how slaves were not invested in the like the results of the labor they were doing, and it kind of just led to like work not being done very well, and pretty much like it kind of hampered or they mentioned like the Roman Empire and like the fall of the Roman Empire, and how like the living conditions kind of fell so much, and there's a lot to read, so I may be missing like some details here, but essentially like led to conditions that kind of, or like contradictions, how you said, that kind of led to like the trying to think, how did it lead exactly?
Well,
maybe you could fill me in there on that, but the Roman Empire kind of like stood out to me as like how the Roman Empire had to expand so much to like get more slaves, and then like you had like organized revolt from slaves and from within the empire and from outside of conquered people who were kind of almost coordinating attacks on the Roman Empire, and that kind of led to its like official downfall eventually. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought that was you brought up a couple good points. First of all, the lack of interest that slaves had in the reproductive process, and you also mentioned war. This is like really important. This is basically the prime contradiction of slave society that gave rise to its downfall was the fact that slave exploitation constantly destroyed the basic productive force of the society, the slaves. I mean, like slaves were often worked to death, and they needed to be replaced by other slaves. And once the small peasantry was basically, enslaved to its limits, then it needed to, the only other option was to go to war and collect slaves that way. And that eventually, as you said, later in the Roman Empire, contributed to its destruction and was, like, in large part the reason for the increased slave revolts at the end of slave society and movements to end that as the major productive form of labor in society. Sophia, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just kind of rereading on that to kind of piggyback off Aaron's point that once a lot of those things were crumbling apart and there was like the vision of land, like things that were usually like common good, like rivers and creeks in the woods, started to be redistributed among the people, or things that were owned by the state. And then there was like rich families and poor families. And so rich families could actually work on their land and have some interest in their actual products. And so that brought in some progress. That's kind of what I was putting together here.
Yeah, that's that's basically the other stuff I was going to add. So yeah, that's a good point. And because of all that, because of what you mentioned, and because of what Aaron mentioned, the supply of slaves began to dry up, and this began a kind of snowball effect in society where the amount of slaves that were available was getting smaller because not only because the amount of slaves was getting smaller because of the fact that there's only a limited number of people in the world, and in the periphery, and warring tribes that were against Rome began to become more successful in their military or in their wars with ancient Rome, and this made it even more difficult for Rome to get slaves, and this caused problems that led to revolts and everything. And eventually, this all caused a general decrease in production in the last 2 centuries of the Roman Empire. And I'm using the Roman Empire here, obviously, as the sort of center point of understanding slave society, because it's the one that everyone knows the most, and also it's the Roman Empire really that it's after the fall of the Roman Empire that slave society completely went away in Europe specifically. So because of these developments, the slave owning productive relations became a fetter on the development of the means of production. History necessitated different relations, basically. These large slave owner holdings became less profitable. Masters began setting groups of slaves free just because it was more expensive to keep them alive than it was to let them go, and maintain, because they just weren't producing enough surplus anymore because of the failing of this social organization. Large land holdings were even split into smaller plots of land, and they were sold to other freemen or former slaves. And the catch for this splitting up of this basically voluntary splitting up of these large land holdings was that the people who bought them also had to offer certain services to slave masters. So these people, this class that developed of people that bought up these smaller plots of land who were not slaves, they were technically free, but at the same time they had some sort of servitude to the slave owners. This new social stratum of small-scale producers, they were called the coloni, and they were the predecessors to feudal serfs born within late slave society. Like we talked about before, late slave society saw an intensification of the class struggle. slave revolts linked up with the struggle of small peasants that were tired of being enslaved because of indebtedness. They emerged against large landowners, and yeah, those are basically the main takeaways from the ending of slave society. Does anyone have? Just a second. Okay, let's kind of review here. So can anyone tell me the main factors that basically gave rise to the development of slavery? Just to reiterate. Yeah, Aaron.
Right. So the main factors that you said led to like the slave owning economy,
Yeah.
kind of. Oh, okay.
Mhm.
So yeah, like surplus of products,
Exactly.
private property, the
Yeah.
extension of private property, kind of like a dependence of the people who didn't own the means of production on those who did at the time. So they were kind of forced, so to speak, to kind of seek their means of living through those people. So they were kind of coerced into like participating in that. They didn't really have a choice. Yeah, the exchange economy kind of, or maybe it's not exchange economy, but the ascension of like exchange between like clans and other like community sects and whatnot, kind of yeah, it kind of led to like those conditions of a very few amount of people owning a large yeah, I guess yeah, private property land. So people owning like a lot of land that people had to live off of, so they had control, they had the material dominance over people, and like the creation of the state to like protect that arrangement and preserve it. And yeah, kind of people just having to keep going along with it to survive. I do remember there was one point where they were saying like slaves weren't, I guess, so worked that they weren't able to kind of like develop a coherent ideology to kind of like combat what was happening to them. And like religion, or I think was it Buddhism, or Christianity came up at the end of the Roman Empire that kind of helped get over that hump. But like Buddhism, I think in the East, was used to kind of perpetuate the slave arrangement, or like keep people like get people to like be okay with like the endless suffering and like thinking of life after death. Yeah, I guess that's how you put it. Yeah, but I think that's pretty much what I got from it.
Yeah, you basically mentioned everything I wanted to say. The appearance of surplus, the origin of private property, the expansion of exchange, which occurred from the growth of the productive forces of society and division of labor. And it's interesting what you talk about with Buddhism, because if I remember correctly, yeah, you're right, because Buddhism at the time sort of enforced a really rigid understanding of where people belong in society. At least I know that was a problem in Tibet when in the Chinese situation, but that's a long discussion we could include in an entirely different video. Anyway, but yeah, that's basically everything I wanted to say. You even mentioned the state, which is important to talk about as well. That it first took shape with the rise of the slave system as an attempt of slave owners to unite in defense of their interests. Couple more conclusions. Slave society increased society's productive forces in relation to primitive communism, and in that sense, it was progressive at the beginning, but then it became regressive. And at that point, slave revolts, and the decreased lucrativeness of slave owning production actually ended to this mode of production being supplanted by feudalism, which at that point became the progressive mode of production. And we're going to talk about that right now, feudalism. It's important to note that feudalism, again, has existed with its particular features of one sort of another in nearly all countries around the world. Even if they did not have communication, between one another. And that's exactly why we look at political economy and the development of society as a science, because this social development occurs because humans are interacting with their objective conditions. Of course, they all have specific national features, but they all go along a very similar trajectory. In China, feudalism existed for more than 2,000 years. In Western Europe, only a number of centuries. And that's from the time of the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century until basically the bourgeois revolutions in England in the 15th century and in the 18th century in France. These were the initial bourgeois revolutions. So basically, I'm going to start with our talk about feudalism, focusing on the tribes that destroyed the Roman Empire, because they're basically the ones that took over after the fall of the Roman Empire. We're talking about the Germans, the Gauls, the Slavs, etc. They all had communal class systems that were in decline by the beginning of feudalism. At the very beginning of feudalism, right after the Roman Empire, they had the land, except for the land holdings and possessions of the clan nobility, they were overwhelmingly held in common. But gradually, more and more of this land began to be inherited by separate families. So at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, we're looking at the decline of the class system, the decline of the clan system in these tribes, and basically their transition from basically early slave society straight into feudalism. And much of the former Roman state lands captured by the tribes, they became actually at first private peasant property, but this wasn't preserved for long. This eventually turned into the system of serfdom, because inequality began to develop in this sphere as it does in under conditions of private property with no regulation. Well-to-do families appeared, poor families appeared in these tribes, and the richer families began to acquire more and more power in the community, and they joined the ranks of the clan aristocracy and landowners. Again, what we were talking about before in slave society. Eventually, the poorer peasants fell into dependency on large landowners, and this new aristocracy concentrated military power within their hands, essentially to use state power to solidify the dependency of the lower aristocracy. So these tribes that were basically in the early stage of slave society, as the Roman Empire was just collapsing, interacted with this Roman Empire that had collapsed, and the outcome was that they created, they developed into a system of feudalism in which these former clan military leaders became feudal monarchs and vassals. And the church also served as an important support for royal power, and they received a lot of land. And land was actually handed out by the king in return for military service. And after it was handed out, it was considered a hereditary possession. And these pieces of land that the king gave out in this way were called fiefs. And this process, this basically was the process of feudalization. And it took place over several centuries. This is basically the early stage of feudalism. And it was characterized by a period in which the free peasantry was ruined by incessant military service, plunder, and impositions by the ruling class. They turned to, they more and more, they were turning to the large landowners for help, and they became dependent because of that. They were often compelled to yield themselves into the protection of feudal lords, because they had to survive in a world of banditry, in a world of ceaseless wars over land holdings that the lords themselves were carrying out. And so this was basically the way that the lords enserfed these people. And this protection was exchanged for working the lords' plots of land at the beginning. This is how feudal lords appropriated the land of the peasantry and their labor. But again, we have to understand that this is not slavery. These serfs were still considered, they were bound to the land, but they were not considered property of the feudal lords. Eventually, the class differences that existed at the beginning of feudalism and at the end of slave society between the coloni, the free peasants and the former slaves, it disappeared for the vast majority of people, and they just became feudal serfs, enserfed peasants. And this process had different characteristics according to where it took place, but the essence, in terms of where it took place, in terms of China, Europe, or whatever, but the essence of the matter was the same everywhere. There were formerly free peasants who fell into dependence on the lords who seized their land, and the level of dependence was different for everywhere. It was different everywhere. But in terms of feudalism in relation to slave society, again, we have a, of course, it's not nice to be an enserfed peasant, but it was a huge development in society over slave society that came before it. And can anyone tell me a couple things as to why feudalism represented a step forward in front of slave society? Yep, Aaron.
Oh yeah, so the kind of the people who were replacing slave labor, they were more invested in the product of their labor. In the results of the results of their work. They had to use their own. Well, I guess because they had to, depending on how they were paying back how they were paying rent. Because I know there's the three kinds of payment you could do. You could do like payment in kind with money, and what's the third one? It was in kind with money, and then with, I guess, just working their land, I believe.
Yeah.
So I guess depending on those, I guess in all of them they had to kind of tend to their own land, and then also kind of worry about their obligation to whoever the landowner was, the serf. The serf is the one that owns the land, right? The one who controls the one that people are working for, the people they're paying rent to is the serf, or that's the, trying to get the terms down.
Yeah, there was the lord of the manor. He owned all of the land, but the serfs, they rented the land. They had holdings that were their own, as long as they fulfilled their rent obligations to the lord.
Right.
Their holding was considered their property.
Oh, right. Okay. So they were, I guess they were kind of less interested in what they gave to the lord, but the majority of their labor, for their own holdings, were a lot more motivated than they were with slavery, since they didn't have anything with slavery. So I guess that was a pretty big improvement for at least their experience there. And then I didn't finish reading this particular passage, so I'm not 100% on the overall productive output of this feudal arrangement versus slavery, since I know how much we grew over with slave production. But yeah, I guess the main point for me was, what I got so far was just that they were a bit more invested in the result of the work they were doing.
Yeah, that was the main thing I was looking for. It's exactly that. The fact that they're a lot more interested in the success of their labor than slaves were, since they're technically, not enslaved. I wouldn't say they're free, but they're enserfed, which is a sort of purgatory in between. And this is what gave rise to, this is what allowed the further development of the productive forces of society, basically, because the dependent peasantry, they possessed their own holdings as long as they paid their rent obligations to the lord. They had their own implements of production, and they had a higher degree of interest in the work than slaves, and therefore slave labor outlived itself. In terms of what you were saying also about you mentioned the technological development of agriculture. In feudalism, it was still very low, specifically in early feudalism. Throughout the entire period of feudalism, the implements of production did increase to a significant level, but it took a very long time. Plows, scythes, sickles, spades, they were all used in labor, and most of it was wooden, was like wood implements, which was really difficult to use. But later on, the iron plow ended up increasing production. But also in early feudalism, for example, grinding grain into flour was done by hand, which is like super ineffective. And that only changed when wind and water mills became widespread. And that was more towards the middle and late feudal period. But no doubt over time, the implements of production and the methods of processing raw materials improved very much. Crafts became specialized, intensifying the division of labor, which all gave rise to higher productivity. And smelting and iron working methods improved dramatically, again, over time. So now I want to talk a bit about the basis of feudal production relations. So Aaron, you basically mentioned a lot of what I wanted to go over here, so I'll just go over it quickly. Like we talked about before, the feudal lord had incomplete property rights over the peasants, unlike slaves. Serfs had their own small holdings, and they were the base workforce of society. The lord could no longer kill his workers with impunity. This was actually against the law in many places. And although back then, if a lord did kill a serf, I mean, the consequence in many places was like a fine. But still, the advancement of the fact that it was against the law is a big step forward. Peasants could be sold like slaves, but the thing is, they can't be sold as chattel. They were, for the most part, bound to the land. So if the land was sold, the peasants were sold along with it, but individual peasants couldn't be sold. There were some exceptions to this. For example, in feudalism in Russia, it was a little different. Peasants were able to be sold individually, but this is a specific characteristic of Russian feudalism, and maybe even Eastern European feudalism in general. I'm just not as familiar with the history of feudalism from those places, but the exploitation of peasants in Eastern Europe and Russia was particularly extreme. So right now we're talking mainly about Western European feudalism. So now we should talk a bit about rent, like you were talking about before, Aaron. Basically, the way the economy worked was that the main productive platform in feudalism was large feudal landed property. Part of this land was called the domain. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it's basically land that is worked for the lord's consumption. And part of it was allotted as holdings to the peasantry for personal use and on extortionate conditions, basically, that were intended to enserf these peasants so that the lords had a regular workforce and they wouldn't be able to get out of their feudal obligations. This is basically how the feudal lords extracted the peasantry's surplus value, and it was expropriated through rent. And as you said, Aaron, there's three types of different rent in feudal society, and in different points of feudal society, each different type of rent was more popular at a time. At the beginning, we had labor rent, and then eventually rent in kind became the generally used form of exploitation, which was when the peasants had to regularly give a certain quantity of goods or livestock to the lord in exchange for using his land. And then it eventually, at the end of feudal society, turned into money rent, which is pretty self-explanatory. You got to pay rent to use the lord's land, which we kind of have consequences of that today. We have landlords, we pay money to them to live in homes. That's kind of, although we don't use houses as productive property, and this is a distinct difference between what we're talking about here and paying a landlord to live in an apartment, but the point still stands. So I'm going to talk about the differences of these forms of rent really quickly. And the fact that the serf's work was divided quite clearly between two categories. Necessary time, this was the time that the peasant spent working the fields to sustain himself and his family, and surplus time, which is what the peasant worked to sustain the lord, and what, the value that was appropriated by the lord. And this is actually, and actually the concept of the work week as we know it in contemporary times comes from labor rent, which I'm going to talk about now. This is what predominated in the early stages of feudalism. The peasant worked certain days of the week for his own survival, for the sustenance of his family, and other days he worked exclusively with his for the lord. And this was all with his own tools on his master's plot of land. Well, not master, sorry, he's not a slave, but on his lord's plot of land. Or if he's not working those plots of land, he also did artisan work or manual labor like construction. Towns, for example, were built by peasants working on the Lord's Day in this sort of labor rent framework. And this time, surplus and necessary labor were clearly divided in space and time. If the peasant was working for his own goals, then that day of work was dedicated to reproduction of necessary labor time. If it was for the lord, this was surplus value. And then this scheme gave rise to rent in kind and money rent later on in feudalism, as I said, which was basically, in kind was just making payments to the lord in agricultural products, and then money in the sense of money rent when that came out. But it's also important to talk about in terms of feudalism that, like slave society, feudalism was a natural economy. The combination of agriculture, it was a combination of agriculture with the auxiliary industry of domestic handicraft, and it was supplemented by trade with wandering travelers. That's also important to understand. Like, exchange also expanded during feudalism quite significantly, but still, by and large, the entire society was almost the entire society was a natural economy. But as feudalism developed, this supplementary trade with wandering travelers, it began to develop into more sophisticated relationships with towns, as the division of labor eventually made handicraft a vocation of the town, while the countryside stuck to agriculture. And that further division of labor caused an expansion of exchange between specifically the countryside and the town, as the countryside got completed manufactured goods from the towns, and the towns got agricultural goods from the countryside. But it's also important to note, at that time, when exchange was developing to the point where towns were becoming very large and expansive, this was at the time that money rent began to predominate, and basically marked the breakdown of feudalism and beginning of capitalist production relations in the womb of feudal society. So in talking about this, I think we should go on to feudal towns. We should talk a little bit about what feudal towns were. They were under the authority of feudal lords still, but they were very unique in relation to the countryside. So does anyone want to talk a little bit about the feudal towns and give some characteristics, what they did, what they were like? Any takers? All right, I'll just go through it then. That's all right. It is getting kind of late, so I want to finish this up pretty quickly. But the feudal towns basically they too owed obligations to the lords, but it was usually paid in kind or money. And these towns, they started to become more and more independent because of their specific trade of handicraftsmanship, which was a bit different than, you know, enserfed peasantry, the way what they produced. They also had a specific relation to the countryside. For example, enserfed peasants could run away to the towns and become free from their obligations if they stayed there for a certain amount of time. So the struggle for freedom from feudal dependence actually began in these towns. They consisted mainly of craftsmen and traders, and they became centers of commodity production within feudal society. And this is where this is specifically distinct from the countryside, where natural economy predominated. And you know, this was where the bourgeoisie was born, which in feudal society was a progressive force. And eventually, craftsmen united into guilds, which were basically organizations of craftsmen that regulated commerce. And these guilds at first helped strengthen and develop urban crafts, but they eventually became a fetter on the expansion of them as exchange and commodity production expanded, because they put very strict rules in place that eventually impeded their expansion. They also began to put insurmountable rules in front of journeymen and apprentices that wanted to become masters in these guilds, which also fettered the development of crafts in the cities. But merchants were no doubt the richest part of the town population, and we should talk about, we're going to talk a bit about them in a second. But basically, I want to make the point that the development of productive forces of society and the growth of the power in the towns began to clash with the narrow framework in which feudal production relations existed, specifically because of this contradiction between countryside and town. The peasantry eventually could not further increase agricultural output, whose labor productivity became comparatively low. You know, society became handicapped by the tyranny of routine and authority of tradition, as it's said in the textbook word for word. And we started to see the emergence of capitalism. The formation of the bourgeoisie, like I said before, through the success of a small minority of commodity producers, and a world market began to emerge. This was formed, and its growth was significantly accelerated after the discovery of the New World as well. So at this point, I also didn't have the chance to write a plan for the rest of the chapter, but there's only about like 5 pages left. I'm just going to go over what I remember reading about these sections myself. It involves the development of feudalism to capitalism. And that, of course, we know occurred as the power of the bourgeoisie grew in society, and primitive capital accumulation began. This was the forcible seizure of peasant lands, which began to be appropriated for the purposes of expansion of commodity production. Here it says capitalist production presupposes 2 basic conditions. One, the presence of numbers of propertyless people, personally free and at the same time deprived of the means of production and livelihood, and therefore compelled to hire themselves out for work to the capitalists. And 2, the accumulation of wealth in money necessary to create large capitalist enterprises. This was basically what the process of primitive capital accumulation caused. The privatization of the commons, for example, that the peasants used for their own subsistence, and their transformation into landless workers that basically became the workforce for capitalist society at its very inception. And this was all, of course, this transition between feudal society and capitalist society was brought about by the bourgeoisie in the English Revolution in the beginning of the 16th century. Germany was also there were peasant uprisings there as well, because again, there was the urban bourgeoisie, but also small peasant proprietors that kind of were aligned with them. And of course, the French Revolution, which is the most renowned bourgeois revolution that shot society forward away from feudalism into the capitalist mode of production. So that's basically all I have to say about the pre-capitalist modes of production. It's a bit longer than I expected, but that's all right. I wanted to cover as much as possible. And yeah, do you guys have any questions or points of discussion you want to cover? Or are you all kind of exhausted?
I can't think of any questions, but great class. I'm looking forward to the next one. Yeah, Caleb, Lily, and I are about to go to the Jimmy Dore show, so I'm gonna have to leave soon. But it was great listening to this class.
Awesome. I'm really glad you guys enjoyed it. And yeah, I'm thinking to give everyone. I know a lot of people want to attend the CPI meeting as well. I don't want to take time away from them, so I'm thinking let's just go straight on to discussing what we're going to do next week. So we got quite a few chapters here. We're looking at, I'm going to share my screen so we can all look at it together. All right. All right, so we just covered pre-capitalist forms of production. And now we're going to go into basically an overview of the concepts from Karl Marx's Capital. So that's chapters 4 to 16. Just a second. I think people are going to need quite a bit more time than we had for pre-capitalist production, productive forms this time, because we've got capitalist, pre-capitalist production, page 64. Yeah, okay, let's do this. The next, since this is like a huge reading, the next meeting we're gonna have, let's do it in 2 weeks. So you all have enough time to read all that. So in 2 weeks, let's say we're gonna have the meeting at the same time at 9, Saturday, July 23rd. Does that sound good to everyone?
Yeah, that sounds
Yep,
good.
sounds good.
All right, cool. All right, then. Well, thanks everyone for participating. And I hope you found this all interesting. I personally think that pre-capitalist modes of production are very interesting to learn about, since, you know, it's kind of so disconnected from our contemporary world. With capitalism, it's more relevant, you know, but to read about how people thought in an entirely different system of social relations is really cool. So thank you all for participating and giving your questions and everything. I'm going to post the recording and I'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Actually, really quick, I had one question really quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
I saw they mentioned the lumpen proletariat in the reading, and I remember, I think Caleb, I still watch Caleb streams a lot, and he mentioned it once too. And I just wanted, if you could clarify what like the lumpen proletariat was like in the context of the slave owning mode of production.
Yeah, lumpen proletariat is like members of the proletariat who aren't actually productive to society. Yeah, so it could be for one reason or another. Like in capitalism, the lumpen proletariat is like considered like criminal elements, homelessness. You know, homeless people who are cyclically homeless and they're not looking for a job or anything. You know, this is these are like lumpen proletariat elements. So like I think in slave society as well as in feudal society, we would be talking mainly about bandits and homeless people that are not existing in the you know, mainstream system of of slavery or serfdom. These people would be considered lumpen proletariat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was my one question.
Yeah, okay. Glad to be helpful. Yeah. Anyway, all right. See y'all later.
All right. See you.
Bye.
Bye.